Parents don't play favorites, right? Wrong. A new report out says parents do play favorites with their children, and there's data that shows which one.
There are certain kids that might trigger us more. They might know how to push our buttons just like they do it with their siblings, right?
How can you as a parent make sure that you're playing fair and not playing favorites? A child psychologist explains what to do.
Like being aware of any biases, being aware of how certain kids are more triggering to you, and maybe thinking of how could the other parent help out.
And we talk one-on-one with the Today Show's Savannah Guthrie about her new children's book coming out this month. That's today on Mom Squad. Hi everyone, thanks for joining me on Mom Squad. I'm Maureen Kyle. Pretty much every parent will say they don't have a favorite. Although I've had a few friends that admit once in a while that they do have a favorite. And if you have siblings, I guarantee you've said something like, well, you are always mom's favorite. The question is, do parents play favorites? An interesting study just came out from the American Psychological Association saying parental favoritism isn't a myth. This study is considered a meta-analysis, which means it took multiple articles, dissertations, and theses looking at almost 20,000 people. It examined birth order, gender, temperament, and personality traits, and how it's linked to parental favoritism. What it found is that parents show favoritism in different ways: how they interact with their children, how much money they spend on them, and how much control they exert over them. So it centers on treatment, positive and negative interactions, resource allocation, meaning money, and control. What they found is that parents tend to favor daughters over sons. That goes for a father-daughter and mother-daughter relationship. They also found that a child who is considered more agreeable and more responsible is favored. If you've watched this show before, I've mentioned that I have 3 kids. I never want to be the parent who plays favorites. But are we doing this and not even realizing it? My expert today is Dr. Carolyn Ivers-Landis with University Hospitals in Cleveland. She and I talk about what's at the root of this study and how to make sure that we don't show favoritism in any unfair way. What did you think of this study when you first read through it?
I felt like this was so needed. I love it that it was a meta-analysis and it looked at so many different studies, because I think you see this like on Reddit or all these things that people are always thinking about this and talking about this, about who was the favorite child, right?
It's interesting, as I've walked around and I've talked to other people in the workplace or friends when I've said, oh, I'm gonna do this interview, the initial reaction isn't, oh yeah, I play favorites with my children. It's funny how people react, oh yeah, my brother was the favorite or my sister was the favorite. They think of themselves as the child and they reflect back on how, even now that we're adults, how we were treated. Is that because, I don't know, why is that we're all just thinking about, oh gosh, my brother was the favorite, instead of how we're parenting?
I know. I wonder if it's hard to be objective about your own parenting and how you treat your children, but as the child, you can maybe judge your parents a little more easily. That's what I'm wondering.
Yeah, and I bring that up because exactly what you just said.
Yeah.
It's hard to objectively take a look at our own parenting, other than if we were that child in the birth order or we were that child within our family. I think that's when people can say, oh, well, that was me, that was easy, I know how this kid is reacting. But how can we take a look at our own parenting, knowing that this is out there, all right, now it's in research, parents do kind of play favorites, how do we step away?
And I feel like, I mean, parenting has so many strong emotions, like from the very positive joy, right, of parenting to being furious or sad or whatever. There's no other role we play in our lives that has so many strong emotions. So I think parents have good, you know, they want to be non-biased, they want to be fair, but you're day to day in the moment dealing with all these little people. And I think that we don't always act perfectly. Sometimes we're mad, we're sad, we're tired, we're frustrated, right? And then there are certain kids that might trigger us more. They might know how to push our buttons just like they do it with their siblings, right? So I feel like that is what happens.
Yeah.
You know?
There's always one of those in the family. And I think even as I talk to my friends as they're going through parenting, in those moments where we are kind of venting about whatever it is in life, I've had friends say, gosh, I'm having so much trouble with this child. And I feel guilty because I know I'm coming down harder on them. Talk to me, if you had somebody, like a parent, come to you and say, I don't know what to do. I feel like this child and I are butting heads. How do you handle that?
I get that all the time, and I see children with sleep disorders. So I see a lot of children that have ADHD, they have autism, and they are keeping their parents up at night, and it is hard.
Yeah.
So I think you have to try to be in the middle. That's what I would say. I don't think it's a good idea to be like, I feel so sorry for this child. This child has a lot going on, so therefore I'm going to kowtow or do whatever to placate this child. I'm going to just let this child run our home and put them on a pedestal because this poor child, right? But then you don't want to be hammering them all day long, like constant negativity, criticism. They're always in trouble. Like, how can you find that middle ground so that you're like realizing, yeah, this child and I butt heads, they push my buttons, whatever. How can you try to be as positive and warm and nurturing as possible, but you're also setting limits with them. And you're not letting them, have the one up on everybody else, because that's not fair either, right? So we can go in the opposite direction, which I have seen.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah.
I do feel like, we've talked to a lot of parents who have maybe a sick child, and then the other one feels left out, or that the other one's getting a lot of attention. What about parents? Because I know you're out there, because I've talked to a couple of parents where they go, they don't say it in front of the kids, but they say, oh, that one's my favorite. Where parents really do have a favorite. What would you say to those parents who kind of deep down know that they favorite one child over the other?
I do think that is a secretive thing, and that I think most people try to not say that. And I really haven't had many of my patients' parents say that to me, interestingly, even as a psychologist. Like, they're not admitting it to anyone where anyone could say it or hear it, correct? So, but I think it's not a horrible thing, right? I mean, just like we choose our spouses, we choose our friends, we don't choose our siblings, we don't choose our parents, we don't choose our children, right, as being the people that we get along with the best. So I think it's normal. I don't feel like people should beat themselves up about that.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And it is one of those hush-hush conversations where, there's certain circumstances where parents have, whispered it, don't say anything, but I think that one's mine. I think about how, and you mentioned it, where it's like one day one kid's pressing your buttons and the other day it's the next kid. And, my kids always look at me and they go, Mom, which one's your favorite? I said, whoever's being the best at the moment, which is kind of what is happening in the study. It says the more agreeable child and the one who's more amicable and the one who, is more responsible. And so it's almost like the easier kid at the moment becomes the favorite. And it might go through phases. Is that, I don't know, is that just nature at that point?
That's kind of like gets into what I was talking about, that we're already stressed with so many roles that we play, and different people in our life are harder to deal with, right? And I think that's a really good point too. Like these studies were probably done at one point in time. They weren't done across longitudinally, because there might be that kid A is going through something and you're like, oh my goodness, I can't wait for them to get out of this phase. But then kid B goes through something else. So it might actually change over time too. And I think the most important thing that I think you kind of talked about is being aware of it. Like being aware of any biases, being aware of how certain kids are more triggering to you, and maybe thinking of how could the other parent help out? How could that be diffused? And that's kind of something that I do in therapy too, is talking about and one of the things that I do too, like let's say a kid is demanding mom has to tuck me in at night, like no matter what, and they'll scream and cry if dad comes. And I'm like, no, mom and dad need to take turns, right? Like I care about relationships with both parents, right? And you might need that mom or you might need that other parent at some point to kind of step in and give you a break, or to kind of call you on some things or say, hey, I've noticed X or Y, right?
Oh, that's such a great point. You just made me realize when my youngest, and the youngest are always the problem, right? Like they're always the most demanding for the most part. You know, she only wanted me to put her to bed, and she only wanted me to get her food. And my husband really struggled with it, but I never made him jump in the way I should have probably made him jump in to make sure that they're fostering that relationship. So it's interesting you bring that up.
Right, and to also feel like that the kid doesn't have total control of everything in the household, that you're like, no, mommy and daddy are taking turns. Like mommy needs a break sometimes too, right? And you need to keep your composure, you need to have a little break so that you can be the best parent that you can be. And it's not all on you, you know?
Yeah, I wanna go back to awareness, because I think about, and kind of how we started this conversation, as a sibling, me and my siblings, we will talk about, well, whatever, you were mom's favorite or your mom's favorite or your dad's favorite. But we never say that to them. I don't think they'll realize that, you know, you never go to your mom or dad and be like, well, you favored so-and-so because, maybe you have that discussion.
Right.
I think I would be heartbroken if 20 years from now, my girls are together and they're going, you were mom's favorite because you did this. You know, I want to make sure that they don't have that experience where they're grown adults and now they're thinking back and going, you were always the one that got everything, or you were always the one who got attention.
Right.
And I'm sure my own parents don't realize that that's how it filtered out. So how do we gain that awareness? Are there signs that kids, you know, have that they do feel that way, or that, you know, they are seeing that maybe they think their sibling's the favorite and they're not?
And I think that, I mean, kids do say things like, oh, they're the golden child or something. You've heard that, right? They can do no wrong. They're the golden child. And you're kind of like thinking to yourself, well, they're more polite to me. They go along better with things. I'm not as annoyed with them because they are being so pleasant, right? But then it perceives like that you like them more. It's not that you like them more, it's just that you're not having to deal with like negativity, right, from them as much. So I think that if you hear that sort of thing, that you can kind of talk to them about that and be like, I love you so, so much, but there are times when I feel like you're not being respectful, or there are times when I have to tell you multiple times to do things, and just everybody is different, but I love you so, so much, right? I mean, it's like, you are my child. I made you in my body. Like, you are my flesh and blood. It's like, to really get that across, and we're all different. It's not like as parents, we're perfect. Like, we have times where we're irritable or short-tempered or frustrated or angry, right? And just say, I'm not perfect either, and I'm not perfect in the way I parent you, but I'm trying, you know, as they get older, you know, to talk like that.
We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, Dr. Ivers Landis talks about how to make sure you're not setting up your kid to play favorites when it comes to parents. We'll be right back. Welcome back. I guarantee that you've joked around that a certain child is your favorite, or argued with your own siblings which one of you was your parent's favorite. But it's not a joke. Science shows that parents play favorites. If you're just joining us, we've been talking with Dr. Carolyn Ivers Landis with University Hospital's Rainbow Babies about how to make sure that you're not treating your kids with favoritism. You mentioned, like even off camera, when we started talking about kids almost need parented differently. Like you can't parent one kid the exact same way as the other because they're different personalities.
Correct.
So
like it would be so
expand
weird.
on that.
Yeah, we're not like Stepford parents. We're not like, we are not AI. We're not robots, thank God, right? Because we don't want to respond the same way to every kid. Every kid is going to need something different. And that's what we have to just embrace that. And there's also natural consequences, which your kids need to learn. Because out in the real world, if they act a certain way to a friend or a teacher or a boss, they're not going to be so happy, right?
Yeah.
So you're kind of letting them know, like, ooh, I don't really like that. I don't like that tone of voice. Or I don't like it when you treat me like that. And like, you're a little microcosm of, you know, the nuclear family, and they're trying these things out, and they're going to be in the real world. So you don't want to just pretend like everything's fine and be like, oh, well, I'm going to talk to him just as nicely as so-and-so, and be like, yeah, I don't really like that, you know?
Yeah.
So I think we have to be careful about that. But as I said, I don't want to go to the other extreme where you're just like hammering the kid. Like, you have to really look for positives. You have to try to do good things together and plan these little special times and things like that. You totally want to do that.
Yeah.
And some of my patients are like that. I just feel like all day long they're just hammered. And then I figure out ways to improve that relationship.
Interesting.
You know?
The other dynamics where I hear about, well, so-and-so plays favorites, or, you know, there's a lot with birth order. And I know we've actually done birth order before on this show, and the truths and the myths, but there is, I even shared with you, where I have 3, and it was like I treated the oldest so much older than I'm treating the youngest. I baby the youngest because she's the baby. Like, some of it is, you can't change the birth order dynamics.
Right.
But do you see where that could change, where people think that, you know, the baby's getting babied, so that's the favorite?
Right. I mean, I think that's so hard because the first one kind of gets kicked to the curb. You know, when the baby comes, like, you're not carrying the first one as much because you have this baby now, right? But if you don't have another one after the baby, you can carry the baby for as long as they want to be carried, right? And then you feel so guilty that this first one had to grow up faster. And I feel like some of that is just natural. Some of it is you have to cut yourself some slack, and some of it is maybe to be aware of that and be careful. And I've had some of my parents of my patients that have been so savvy about it that I'm like, wow, I wish I were more like that when I was, you know, had young children. Because they're like, oh, I'm doing X, Y, or Z to make sure my bigger kid is really gonna feel okay and is not gonna feel jealous.
Interesting.
And I'm like, wow, that's impressive.
Are they doing extra for the kid? Like, what are some examples, just in case somebody's going, how do I handle this? I have this baby now, and I think every oldest sibling has felt that jealousy.
I know. I mean, just to make sure that they have time alone with mom, because I think mom, especially, you know, moms who are breastfeeding or whatever, you're just with the baby all the time. And to figure out how can dad take over, someone else take over, so mom can have time with the older kiddo, like one-on-one regularly. And it's not just like, hey, entertain yourself, I'm feeding the baby, I'm changing the baby, whatever. How can you really have that alone time and really pay really positive, close attention to that older kiddo, which is hard to do in the moment, I think.
The other dynamic where I see, or hear, especially, again, it's the adults who say, oh, well, looking back, you know, I'm thinking of, like, my husband was the youngest and the only boy and has 2 older sisters. And the sisters will always be like, oh, he was so favored because he was the only boy. And so you have those family dynamics where there might be multiple of one gender and only one of the opposite gender. And so it's always like, oh, well, you got favored or you got extra attention because you were the only boy or only girl. But then again, you know, you don't parent. Sometimes you don't parent them the same.
I know.
So how do you navigate that, do you think?
I know, and I think we should also think, even though this study just looked at parents, what about grandparents?
Oh,
Think about that. Think about that. Everybody is probably like, yes, because think about the dynamic is how many cousins are there? Who's the oldest? Who's the youngest? There might even be one family that they feel like the grandparents favor over another family, right? So I feel like a lot of it, as we talked about, you have to be aware of that and think to yourself and kind of question yourself and talk to your partner or someone else, like, am I being unfair? Like, I think even the article talked about money, right?
Yes.
That maybe, are you giving more money? And I feel like people in, like, if you read Reddit or something, then people that are struggling the most might get more money. Right? Because a parent is like, oh, they're going to have a harder time, I need to help them. But then the other kids are like, oh, I'm getting punished for being competent and successful and things like that. So I feel like you really have to think through some of these things that you're doing. Like, and maybe it is okay because maybe somebody does need your help more. But if you talk it through with the other kids and really say, this is why, this is my reasoning, what do you guys all think? Right?
Yeah. So is it a matter of being open and honest with kids, and then at what age? Like, what kind of steps should a parent take to make sure they are hitting fairness in the ways that it counts?
You know, one of my parents just this past week told me this example, which I thought was great. She was saying her older daughter got fewer presents for Christmas than the younger son. But they talked to her about it. It's like, you have fewer because your presents were more expensive. I was like, that is so sweet. Like, they were literally thinking about that. So she wouldn't feel like, well, why does he have 10 and I have 5, right?
Right.
So they were really paying attention to that. And then she was like able to be like, okay, that makes sense. And she's pretty little, you know?
Oh, okay. So they, I mean, like, they can kind of comprehend some of the, I guess, what age does fairness, I mean, I think of little kids always going, that's not fair.
I know.
So we should always be talking about fairness.
I think so too. And I think it's not always going to be exactly, there's going to be times where maybe you'll get a little more, you'll get a little more. And I mean, we literally cannot be perfect. There's absolutely no way. And moms especially beat ourselves up and have horrible mom guilt, right? I have moms crying in my office so often. And I'm like, you are wonderful. You're doing everything, you're the best that you can do, right? So just to really talk about it from the very beginning, talk about how much you adore and love each child, and they're different, but you still adore them so much, right? You would do anything for your kids, right?
A big thank you again to Dr. Carolyn Ivers-Landis. Coming up, I got a chance to talk one-on-one with the Today Show's Savannah Guthrie about her new children's book coming out, why she says it was important to her as a mom to write it. Today, co-anchor Savannah Guthrie has a new children's book coming out later this month. She's co-authored 2 children's books before, but the third is hers and hers alone. She and I got a chance to catch up about it. The book is called Mostly What God Does Is Love You. Savannah, this is your book, your baby. Tell me about why you wanted to write this one.
Well, I wrote a book about a year ago called Mostly What God Does, and it was a collection of essays about faith. And at the same time, the editor talked to me about maybe doing a children's book. And I thought, you know what, this actually goes together really well. Even though the first book was for grown-ups, of course, and talks about different aspects of faith and can get pretty complex, the basic message of it, that mostly what God does is love you, love us. That is something simple enough for a child to understand. And so I actually immediately had this idea, this vision that, you know, there could be a very sweet and gentle picture book that kind of lays kids down to rest with that beautiful knowledge of that foundation, that though they are small and God is big, he's never, you know, they're never too small for him, and that, you know, he holds the whole world in his hands, but mostly, especially them. And I think that that's just a beautiful message, a way to introduce God to children. I hope it's a good reminder for parents, those weary parents who are reading late at night with the baby in the hand and trying to get those kids to sleep, that maybe sometimes that message will resonate with them as well.
How do you see this as a connection? I know that, you know, every parent wants to sit down, read a book, and connect in that way with their children. But when you add in faith, how does that add an extra layer of connection?
You know, I think kids have so many questions, and really good questions, sometimes questions that are impossible to answer, about God and faith and the world and how things work. And so I hope that this is a way that starts a conversation and maybe introduces some of those questions. By the way, when my kids ask me questions like that, half the time I learn more from the experience and from that connection than they probably ever do. So I hope it's that, and I also hope it's just a reassurance and a feeling of security and calm, so that it's sometimes a conversation starter, and that sometimes it's a conversation ender, and it's a good night. You know, it's kind of like, I loved when I had little babies, those books that were like On the Night You Were Born, and it's very much in that vein. Is this like a really sweet, peaceful, serene, really pretty pictures and pastels, in a way to say goodnight, but say goodnight hopefully wrapped in this blanket of unconditional love and security.
Yeah. How does the message from the adult version parlay into the message that you have for children?
You know, it's interesting because it really complements each other very, very well, because, you know, I tried to take on some of the hard issues and those challenges of faith in the grown-up book. But as I said before, it's like the basic message that, you know, we wonder, where is God? What is he up to? What does God think of me? And this profound realization that I had through Scripture that, you know, mostly what God is doing at any given time is loving us. Well, that is a very profound and deep and beautiful message that you can reflect upon for a whole lifetime, really. But it's also very simple. It's simple enough for a child to understand. And I think that's like a really good starting point for faith. You know, as somebody that grew up in the church, and, you know, we went to church, gosh, I don't know, 4 or 5 times a week. And I was in the church choir. My mom taught Bible study. My dad taught Sunday school. And, you know, I loved that upbringing, but there were also aspects of it that I had to overcome. You know, especially as a child, I was really afraid of God. I felt guilty all the time. And so this is a reminder of what God says about himself, that he is love. And I'm hoping that that's a real bonding experience for kids and also for their parents, a good reminder.
Yeah. As a mom, as you've been giving this message to your own children, if you don't mind my asking, has there ever been something that they said that made you realize that it's really sinking in?
Yeah, there have been some of these moments. I mean, I wish if I had a moment, I'd look it up on my phone. My little boy said something recently, and it was basically like, well, Mom, you know, but God is always all around. Like, you know, it was probably something to do with going to church or whatever. But he's like, but Mom, God's always with us. And I just, in that moment, I was like, that's right, sweetie, he is, you know? And you know, where you're like, okay, it's getting through, or, you know, they're connecting with this. And look, you know, I said this about the grown-up book. I say it again about the kids' book. I'm not trying to preach or proselytize. This is not a heavy-handed book at all. I mean, I really believe that as a mom, you know, my job is to try to tell my kids about this God that I know, this God that loves them. And then after that, you know, they're going to grow up and it's going to be their choice. They're going to choose. And my hope is that by having this connection with God, that God will be able to meet them and have that opportunity with them. And then I always know that I always say, well, God will take it from there. And I have full faith that he will and make that connection.
It's such a lovely concept. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. And people can pre-order right now?
They can pre-order right now, and I put on Instagram, I'm going on a little book tour and going to lots of different places, St. Louis and Chicago area and Houston and the Philly area. So if you're in town or you feel like going on a girls trip or something, come see me. I would love to see folks.
I love it. I'm happy for you. Savannah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you. Savannah's new children's book, Mostly What God Does Is Love You, hits bookstands on Tuesday, February 25th, but it's available for pre-order right now. Thank you for joining me here on Mom Squad. You can catch all of our episodes streaming on your local news app or on the Mom Squad YouTube page. I'm Maureen Kyle. We'll see you back here next week.